If you drive down the highway in Houston, Texas, you will see miles of steel pipes, cracking towers, and storage tanks shimmering in the heat. It looks like a monument to American industrial power. It looks like the engine of the free world. But if you look at those refineries through the eyes of a forensic accountant, you are not looking at American industry. You are looking at a prison cell. And the prisoner inside that cell is a country called Venezuela. Turn on the news today. You see the headlines. You see the poverty in Caracas. You see the lines for gasoline in a country that sits on top of the largest oil reserves in the solar system. You see the hyperinflation that turned money into confetti. We are taught in school that this is a story of political failure. We are told that Venezuela failed because of socialism. We are told it failed because a bus driver named Nicolas Maduro didn't know how to run an economy. We are told it is a tragedy of corruption. But that is a fairy tale for the naive. That is the story they tell you so you don't ask to see the books. If you strip away the politics, if you ignore the speeches about democracy and tyranny, and you look at the raw financial data of the last 100 years, you will see a very different story. You won't see a suicide. You will see a murder. You will see a hostile corporate takeover that took a century to execute. You will see a foreclosure process where a creditor, the United States, systematically dismantled the debtor's ability to pay, drove the valuation of the asset into the ground, and then right now in the year 2025 is finally seizing the collateral. This is not a story about ideology. The ledger does not care about Marx or Adam Smith. The ledger only cares about leverage. And the destruction of Venezuela was a calculated $300 billion operation to ensure that the engine of the American empire never runs out of fuel. To understand how a nation with 300 billion barrels of oil goes bankrupt, you have to identify the villain. The villain is not a person. It is not Hugo Chavez. It is not Donald Trump. The villain is a concept in economics called monopsony. You know what a monopoly is. It's when there is only one seller and they can charge whatever they want. A monopsony is the opposite. It is a market where there is only one buyer. And when there is only one buyer, they can pay whatever they want. For 100 years, the United States engineered a reality where it was the only customer that mattered for Venezuelan oil. This wasn't an accident of geography. It was a feat of engineering. You have to understand the geology to understand the bankruptcy. Venezuelan oil, specifically the oil from the massive Orinoco Belt, is not like Saudi oil. Saudi oil is light and sweet. It flows like water. You can refine it anywhere. Venezuelan oil is extra heavy and sour. It is sludge, it is tar, it is full of sulfur and heavy metals. To turn that sludge into gasoline, you need massive, complex, billion-dollar refineries. You need specific technology called coking units to crack the heavy molecules. In the 1920s and 30s, the American oil giants, Standard Oil, Gulf, Texaco, made a strategic decision. They discovered this oil in Venezuela, but they didn't build the refineries in Venezuela. They built them in Lake Charles, Louisiana. They built them in Corpus Christi, Texas. They specifically designed the energy infrastructure of the U.S. Gulf Coast to be the only lock that fits the Venezuelan key. This was the trap. This meant that Venezuela was not a sovereign nation. It was a company town, and the company store was Washington, D.C. If Venezuela ever tried to sell its oil to Europe or Asia, they couldn't. No one else had the machines to process it. The shipping costs to move that heavy sludge across the ocean destroyed the profit margin. Venezuela was structurally, physically, and financially shackled to the United States. The mechanism of the heist was simple. Make the victim totally dependent on a single revenue stream, and then, whenever they try to renegotiate the contract, threaten to shut off the valve. We have to go back to the original signature on the mortgage. The year is 1922. The location is the Baraso No. 2 well in the Maracaibo Basin. A geyser of black oil explodes into the sky. It rains oil for days. It reveals a reserve of wealth so vast it terrified the global markets. At that moment, Venezuela was an agricultural nation. It grew coffee. It grew cocoa. It fed itself. But the American oil men arrived with their checkbooks. They didn't just buy the oil rights. They bought the economic soul of the country. They engaged in a process that economists call the Dutch disease, but they did it on a continental scale. The massive influx of petrodollars made the Venezuelan currency artificially strong. This sounds good, right? A strong currency? Wrong. For a developing nation, a strong currency is a poison pill. It made Venezuelan coffee too expensive for the world to buy. It made imported American food cheaper than growing it locally. Why grow rice in the Portuguese estate when you can import it from Arkansas for half the price? Why make shoes in Caracas when you can buy them from New York? Within 20 years, the Venezuelan agricultural sector was dead. The industrial sector was dead. The country stopped producing value and started extracting rent. By the 1950s, Venezuela was importing its lettuce, its milk, its cars, and its clothes from the United States. They were the richest country in Latin America on paper, but on the balance sheet, they were a wholly owned subsidiary of the American energy sector. They were rich in cash flow, but they were bankrupt in sovereignty. Even the so-called nationalization in 1976 was a fraud. We are told that Venezuela took over its oil industry in the 70s. That is a lie. The government took ownership of the wells, yes. But the American companies kept the service contracts. They kept the technology licenses. They kept the marketing networks. PDVSA, the state oil company, became a state within a state. Its executives didn't answer to the president of Venezuela. They answered to the market in Houston. They lived in Miami. They sent their kids to American schools. They ensured that the oil was sold to their U.S. partners at a discount. They called it transfer pricing. I call it looting. They were selling the nation's birthright for pennies on the dollar, ensuring the U.S. refineries kept the profit margins, while the Venezuelan state took the risk. This was the status quo for decades, a perfect machine of extraction. Venezuela pumped the sludge, the U.S. refined the gold, and the Venezuelan elite got a kickback to keep the population quiet. It was a stable arrangement until one man decided to audit the books. Fast forward to 1999. Hugo Chavez takes power. Now, whether you love him or hate him is irrelevant to the ledger. You can call him a socialist, a populist, a dictator, I don't care. What matters to a forensic historian is that he acted like a new CEO taking over a failing company. He looked at the accounts, he looked at the Orinoco Belt projects, and he realized the scam. He saw that under the Apertura Petrolera, or the oil opening of the 1990s, the foreign oil companies were paying a royalty of just 1%. 1%. Imagine that. You own the largest asset on earth, and you're selling it for a 1% fee. It was the greatest robbery in corporate history. Chavez decided to renegotiate. In 2001, he passed the new hydrocarbons law. He raised the royalty from 1% to 30%. He told ExxonMobil, he told Chevron, he told ConocoPhillips, if you want our oil, you pay the market rate. If you don't like it, leave. This was the moment the war began. It wasn't about democracy. It wasn't about freedom of the press. It was about the profit margin of the shareholders in Texas. That 30% royalty would have transferred billions of dollars from American bank accounts to the Venezuelan treasury. The bank, the United States, decided to foreclose immediately. The response was the coup of 2002. And look at the details of that coup. It wasn't led by a military general. It was led by Pedro Carmona, the head of the Chamber of Commerce. It was a boardroom takeover. The United States recognized the coup government within hours. Why? Because the very first thing the coup government did, before they even suspended the Constitution, before they dissolved the Supreme Court, was to announce they were restoring the old royalty rates. It was a corporate restructuring disguised as a political revolution. They were putting the management back in charge. When Chavez survived the coup, thanks to the loyalty of the Army paratroopers and the people in the slums, the strategy of the U.S. shifted. If they couldn't fire the CEO, they would burn down the factory. Then came the oil strike of 2002-2003. The Western media called it a general strike. That is a lie. A general strike is when the workers stop working. This was a lockout. The executives of PDVSA, the old guard who answered to Washington, decided to shut down the industry from the top down. But you can't just turn off an oil field like a light switch. It requires complex software. The Venezuelan oil industry was run by a digital brain, a system called Intesa. Intesa was a joint venture with an American tech firm, SAIC. In December 2002, the executives changed the passwords. They engaged in remote sabotage. They used satellite uplinks to scramble the electronic brains of the refineries. It was the first act of cyber warfare in history committed by a corporation against a sovereign state. They paralyzed the country's cash flow. They froze the tankers in the harbors. Chavez responded with the whistle. He went on television and fired 18,000 of these executives and managers by name. The Western media screamed that he was purging the experts. They said he was destroying the industry by firing the talent. But from a business perspective, he was breaking a sabotage operation. He brought in retirees, university students, and the military to hack the systems and restart the pumps. They got the oil flowing again, but the damage was done. This is a crucial point in the bankruptcy. The institutional memory of the industry fled. The geologists, the petroleum engineers, the software guys, they went to Houston. They went to Calgary. They went to Bogota. They took the geological maps, the maintenance schedules, and the technical data with them. The efficiency of PDVSA began to bleed out. The U.S. had successfully decapitated the technical capacity of the rival firm. Venezuela controlled the wells again, but they had lost the brain. For a few years, they got lucky. The China boom happened. Oil hit $100 a barrel. From 2004 to 2012, Venezuela was flush with cash. Chavez used this money to pay off the IMF, to build housing, to reduce poverty. He tried to diversify, but he made a fatal error, a strategic blunder that would cost his country everything. He didn't fix the monopsony. He was still selling the majority of the oil to the United States. He tried to buy insurance. He bought Citgo, the refinery network in the U.S. He thought owning the gas stations and the refineries in America gave him leverage. He thought, if I own the supply chain, they can't hurt me. He was wrong. He didn't realize that by buying Citgo, he was just parking his best asset inside the enemy's jurisdiction. He put his collateral within reach of the repo man. He thought it was an asset. It turned out to be a hostage. After Chavez died in 2013, the trap snapped shut. The price of oil crashed in 2014. It dropped from 100 to 30. Venezuela IS revenue dropped from $80 billion a year to $20 billion. The Dutch disease came back with a vengeance. They had no agriculture. They had no industry. They only had oil, and the oil was worthless. Any normal country in this situation would restructure its debt. That is standard procedure. You go to the bankruptcy court, you go to the bondholders, and you say, look, I can't pay you 100 cents on the dollar right now. Let's work out a deal. Let's extend the timeline. But Venezuela was not allowed to be a normal country. The financial war moved from the shadows to the open. In 2015, President Obama signed an executive order declaring Venezuela an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security of the United States. Think about the absurdity of that. Venezuela, a threat to the U.S. military? It was a legal necessity. You cannot impose sanctions on a country unless you declare a national emergency. That declaration was the legal foundation for the siege. Then in 2017, the Trump administration signed the kill shot, Executive Order 13808. This is the smoking gun of the bankruptcy. It didn't ban oil imports yet. That came later. It did something much more insidious. It banned Venezuela from restructuring its debt. Read the fine print. The U.S. government made it illegal for U.S. banks or U.S. citizens to buy new debt from Venezuela. Why does that matter? Because to restructure debt, you have to swap old bonds for new bonds. By banning new bonds, the U.S. legally forced Venezuela into default. They locked the doors of the bankruptcy court so the debtor couldn't file for protection. It was a calculated strangulation. They knew Venezuela wanted to pay. Maduro was paying billions to Wall Street while his people were literally starving. He cut imports of food and medicine by 70% just to keep paying the bondholders, hoping to avoid a default that would allow the U.S. to seize Citgo. It was the financial equivalent of a man cutting off his own arm to pay the mortgage, only for the bank to raise the interest rate. This triggered the era of the hunger bonds. In May 2017, Goldman Sachs bought $2.8 billion worth of PDVSA bonds for pennies on the dollar, paying just $865 million. They bought them from the desperate Venezuelan central bank. The U.S. political establishment feigned outrage. They called them hunger bonds. But this was the plan. Force Venezuela to sell its future for cents on the dollar just to survive another month. Then came 2019, the interim government strategy. The U.S. declared that Nicolas Maduro was not the president. They recognized Juan Guaido, a man who had never won a presidential election. This wasn't about democracy. It was a legal fiction designed to facilitate a bank robbery. By recognizing Guaido, the U.S. transferred control of Venezuela's bank accounts in New York and London to this shadow government. The Bank of England seized $2 billion in Venezuelan gold. The U.S. seized Citgo. Suddenly, the Maduro government lost control of its biggest foreign asset. Citgo, valued at over $13 billion, stopped sending dividends to Venezuela. That is billions of dollars a year in revenue that used to buy medicine and insulin and grain. Now, it was frozen in American accounts. The shadow board, appointed by Guaido, took over Citgo. And what did they do? Did they save the money for the Venezuelan people? No. They used Citgo's corporate funds to pay for their own political expenses, their own lawyers, and their own lobbying. They burned the asset from the inside. This was the strangulation phase. The sanctions blocked the spare parts for the refineries. The economy contracted by 80%. That is a number usually only seen in countries that have been nuked. It was the largest economic collapse of a peacetime nation in modern history. And it was entirely engineered. The goal was to force a capitulation, to make the rubble bounce, to drive the value of the assets so low that they could be bought for nothing. And now we arrive at the endgame, the foreclosure. The events of 2024 and 2025, the final stripping of the carcass. We need to talk about the alter ego ruling. This is the legal trick that allowed the seizure. Legally, a corporation like Citgo is separate from the government. If the government owes money, you can't take the corporation's assets. That is the corporate veil. But a U.S. judge in Delaware, Judge Leonard Stark, ruled that because the Guaido government, the government the U.S. installed, had used PDVSA funds for political purposes, the company was an alter ego of the state. Therefore, the corporate veil was pierced. Therefore, Citgo could be auctioned off to pay the debts of the Venezuelan state. Do you see the circular logic? The U.S. recognized a puppet government. The puppet government mishandled the funds, and the U.S. courts used that mishandling as the excuse to liquidate the asset. The auction began. It was a feast for vultures. The list of claimants was miles long. Crystalex, a Canadian miner, ConocoPhillips, Siemens, and the vulture funds, distressed debt specialists who had bought Venezuelan debt for pennies. In late 2025, the auction results started coming in. A bidding war for the corpse. An affiliate of Elliott Investment Management, the most notorious vulture fund in the world, the same people who seized an Argentine naval ship a decade ago, put in a bid. Then Gold Reserve put in a bid. The numbers tell the story. Citgo was valued at up to $13 billion in a normal market. The bids were coming in at $5 billion, $6 billion, $7 billion. It was a fire sale. The U.S. court was selling the strategic refining capacity of a sovereign nation for 50 cents on the dollar. In Venezuela, the actual government in Caracas, they weren't even allowed in the room. The U.S. courts blocked them from sending lawyers. They said, "We don't recognize you." Imagine being sued, but the judge forbids you from hiring a lawyer, rules against you by default, and then sells your house to the plaintiff for half price. That is what happened to Citgo. This sale is the death blow. Without Citgo, Venezuela loses its ability to refine its oil in the U.S. market permanently. It loses its strategic anchor. It loses the hard currency engine. The economists estimate the total damage. Francisco Rodriguez, a Venezuelan economist, estimates the revenue loss from the sanctions strategy at over $200 billion. Other estimates go as high as $300 billion. That is 3 times the size of the entire Venezuelan economy at its peak. The $300 billion is not just a number. It is the hospitals that have no generators. It is the schools that have no roofs. It is the millions of refugees walking through the Darien Gap. That poverty is the sunk cost of the U.S. oil war. And look at the result. The U.S. didn't get democracy. They didn't get a free Venezuela. What did they get? They got the oil. In 2023, the U.S. granted a special license to Chevron to return to Venezuela. While everyone else was sanctioned, Chevron was allowed to pump oil. Why? To pay off the debts owed to Chevron. The U.S. oil majors are returning, but they are returning as conquerors, not partners. They are dictating the terms. The new contracts will be written in English. The disputes will be settled in New York. The royalties will be minimal. The monopsony has been restored. The rebellion has been crushed. The tragedy of Venezuela is not that it failed. It is that it was not allowed to succeed. The 100-year war was a demonstration of a brutal reality. In the global financial system, sovereignty is a privilege, not a right. And if you sit on 300 billion barrels of oil, you do not own that oil. You're merely holding it for the empire until they decide they need it back. The poverty you see on the news is the receipt. The ruins of the Venezuelan economy are the balance sheet. And the pumps at Citgo that will soon be pumping cheap gas into American SUVs are the dividend. I'm James, and this is The Hidden Balance. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw the foreclosure coming. Don't forget to subscribe. Join those who see what others ignore.